I never considered myself a paranoid person. Living in a bustling city center, surrounded by the hum of traffic and the distant chatter of strangers, I found comfort in the anonymity of it all. My roommate, Eric, was the opposite. He'd turn in early every night, oblivious to the world outside our apartment walls. That's when the city became mine. Around midnight, I'd lace up my sneakers, grab my headphones, and wander the empty streets. It wasn't about exercise or even curiosity. Walking was my way of untangling the mess of thoughts that piled up during the day. It was peaceful, at least until that night. The air was crisp, the kind that makes your breath visible under the glow of streetlights. The streets were eerily quiet to quiet, now that I think about it. My usual route took me past shuttered storefronts and dimly lit alleyways, their shadows stretching long and sharp. The city felt different that night, like it was holding its breath. As I turned onto a particularly desolate street, I saw him. At first, I thought he was just another late-night wanderer. He stood under a flickering lamppost, unnervingly tall and lanky, dressed in an old-fashioned suit that looked like it belonged in a black and white photograph. His head was tilted upward, his face obscured by the shadows. I slowed my pace, debating whether to cross the street or turn back. Before I could decide, he moved. It wasn't a normal movement. He twirled, almost like he was dancing, his limbs bending in ways that didn't seem natural. Then he stopped abruptly, his head snapping toward me. That's when I saw it, his smile. It wasn't a polite grin or even a sinister smirk. It was impossibly wide, stretching ear to ear, as if his face were split open, and his eyes lifeless, staring not at me, but through me. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, grinning that grotesque, cartoonish smile. It's strange how quickly the city can turn from a familiar place to something entirely foreign. That night, everything felt off. Even the hum of distant traffic seemed muffled, as if the world had shrunk to just me and him, this strange, unsettling figure. I kept walking, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Every step felt like it might be my last. I tried to brush off the feeling. It was nothing, I told myself. People were odd, especially at night. The city was full of eccentrics and outcasts. Still, something about that man, the way he stood, frozen in the shadows, kept pulling my attention back. I couldn't shake the sensation that he was watching me, waiting. As I walked past him, I noticed the absence of sound around me. Normally, there would be the distant murmur of traffic, the soft rustle of wind through leaves, or even the occasional car driving by. But there was nothing. It was as if the city itself had paused, holding its breath. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I forced myself to keep moving. I didn't want to look back, but I did. I couldn't help it. There, at the end of the street, in the dim glow of a dying streetlight, he was still there, still watching, still smiling. At this point, I should have crossed to the other side of the street, should have turned and run. But I didn't. I told myself it was a trick of the light. Maybe I'd imagined the way he moved, the way his smile twisted unnaturally. Maybe he was just some drunk with a weird sense of humor. I laughed nervously under my breath, but the sound felt hollow. It was then I noticed something else. His clothes, they weren't just old-fashioned. They were wrong. His suit, tailored and pristine, didn't belong in a modern city. It looked like it belonged to someone from another time, another world entirely. The kind of suit you'd see in an old photograph from decades ago. I wanted to keep walking, to keep moving forward. But the thought of being alone with him, in that empty street, made my skin crawl. I kept walking, my pace quickening, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe I was tired. But every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave, to get out of that street, away from the man under the flickering light. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence, but the unease in my chest only grew heavier. I was just about to turn the corner, to put some distance between us, when I heard it, a sharp sound like a crack in the air. My breath caught in my throat as I turned, expecting to see something normal, maybe the wind or a distant car. But no, the man was no longer standing under the lamppost. He was closer. I didn't see him move, but he was suddenly much nearer to me, his long limbs unnaturally stretched. His face still obscured by the shadows, tilted downward, and that smile, God, that smile was wider than ever, stretching unnervingly far across his face. His eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, unfeeling. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My mind screamed for me to run, to escape, but my body refused to obey. The city had gone silent again, the air thick with tension. I didn't know what I was waiting for, some sign that this was just some sick joke or a prank, but I got nothing. Then, as if sensing my paralysis, he took a step forward. It was slow, deliberate, like he was savoring my fear. My feet finally moved, running, stumbling, desperate to escape. I didn't care where I went, as long as it was away from him. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how many turns I made, I could always feel him behind me. His presence, like an invisible weight pressing down on me, never let up. I could hear him, almost like he was matching my pace, always keeping just a few steps behind. I looked over my shoulder once. Big mistake. There he was, his smile still stretched impossibly wide, his eyes locked on mine with an intensity that sent a shock of fear straight through my bones. And then I heard it, his voice, soft and smooth, like silk against glass. "You can't outrun me, you know." In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the man, it was everything. The city, once so familiar, felt foreign, hostile. The streets I'd walked down 100 times now seemed strange and menacing, like they were hiding something just beyond the corner of my vision. I tried to forget about that night. I tried to tell myself it was just a figment of my imagination, the product of too much solitude and not enough sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, his smile would flash behind my eyelids, and I'd wake up in a cold sweat. Eric had noticed my restlessness. He asked me if I was okay, if something had happened, but I just shrugged it off. He didn't understand. He had his own world, his own routine. To him, everything was normal, and that was the way it should be. But I wasn't normal anymore. I started avoiding the streets where I had seen the man. But even when I took different routes, even when I stayed inside for days, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. That wasn't paranoia, it was real. Something was following me, lurking just out of sight. One night, I decided to walk again. Maybe I was hoping to confront whatever this was head on. Maybe I was just desperate to prove to myself that I wasn't crazy. I stepped out into the cool night air, but the instant I did, I felt it. The oppressive weight in the air, the sense that something wasn't right. That's when I noticed something even more unsettling. The people around me, the ones out walking their dogs, the late-night joggers, none of them seemed to notice anything. They were moving as though everything was normal. I watched them, wondering if I was the only one who could sense the unease, or if they were pretending, hiding their own fear behind fake smiles and normalcy. Then, as I passed a calf, I saw him again. He was sitting at a table, sipping a coffee, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. His eyes locked on mine across the street. The smile was gone, replaced by something worse, a look of cold recognition. He knew me. I couldn't breathe. The world felt like it was closing in, and I was trapped in it. I thought I had been prepared for anything. I thought I had already faced the worst of it, but I was wrong. The next night, I found myself back on the streets again. It wasn't by choice. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think straight. The creeping dread was too much, and I was desperate to confront it, to end this nightmare once and for all. I needed answers. I knew the place I had to go. The alley. The lamppost. It was where I had first seen him. I had hoped, foolishly, that if I went back, I could prove to myself that it was just a hallucination, just a trick of the mind. But as I turned the corner and walked toward the alley, I saw it. The street was empty. Too empty. The lights above flickered and hummed, but the usual noise of the city, the honking cars, the chatter, the distant rumble of footsteps was completely absent. It was as if the city itself had been erased, reduced to a hollow shell. And then I heard it. That sound. The same crack in the air that had signaled his presence before. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. I didn't need to look to know he was there. I could feel him, like a shadow stretching out across the pavement, reaching for me. I turned slowly and saw him standing under the lamppost again. His face was visible this time, though it was worse than before. His eyes were no longer just empty. They were filled with something. Something dark. Something ancient. "You came back," he said, his voice smooth, almost welcoming. "I knew you would. I should have run. I should have turned and bolted, but I couldn't." I was paralyzed by the sight of him, by the smile that was stretched across his face, wider than ever. My legs refused to move. My breath caught in my throat. And then something happened that I couldn't explain. The air seemed to warp. The shadows around me twisted unnaturally, crawling along the ground like they had a life of their own. The lamppost flickered, casting strange, erratic shadows across the street. Suddenly, I realized that I wasn't alone in the alley anymore. There were figures in the shadows' shapes, indistinct and moving. They had no faces, no bodies, just dark silhouettes shifting in and out of sight. They were closing in on me, surrounding me. And the man, he stood perfectly still, watching, smiling that smile that never seemed to end. "I warned you," he whispered. "You can't escape." I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in that alley, surrounded by those things. My mind was screaming for me to run, to fight, but my body wouldn't obey. I felt like I was suffocating, trapped in some kind of nightmare where escape wasn't an option. The man, no, the thing that looked like him didn't move. He just stood there, smiling. But it wasn't a smile of joy or amusement. It was something worse. It was like he was savoring my fear, feeding off it. The shapes in the shadows closed in, their outlines flickering like they couldn't decide what they were. One of them brushed past me, its presence so cold, I could feel it seeping into my skin. I jerked back, but there was nowhere to go. The alley was too narrow, too dark. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The figures vanished. The air cleared. The oppressive weight that had been pressing on my chest lifted. I looked around, my breath ragged, and for a moment, I thought maybe it had all been in my head. Maybe I was just seeing things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned, and there he was again, standing at the end of the alley, as if nothing had happened. His smile was still there, but his eyes, they were different now. More intense. More knowing. "You're not ready," he said, his voice low, almost mocking. "But you will be." I ran. I ran as fast as I could, not caring where I went, not caring if I was making a fool of myself. I needed to get out of there, away from him, away from whatever this was. But even as I fled, I felt his eyes on me. I felt his presence following, like a shadow that never left my side. It was inescapable. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how many turns I made, I knew deep down that he was always there, just out of sight, waiting. I couldn't tell anyone what had happened. How could I? They would think I was crazy. I barely believed it myself. But it didn't matter, because I knew he knew what had happened, and he was never going to let me forget it. The days that followed were a blur. I tried to go about my life as usual, but it was impossible to ignore the weight of what I had experienced. My mind raced constantly, replaying the events over and over, searching for meaning, for answers. But the more I thought about it, the more hopeless it seemed. I couldn't make sense of what I'd seen. Nothing about that night made any logical sense. I started to withdraw from people. I couldn't talk to Eric. He'd think I was losing my mind. And the more I stayed inside, the worse it got. Darkness felt closer. The silence in my apartment felt suffocating. I couldn't even trust the sounds around me. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, felt like it was something more, something watching me. But I couldn't live like this forever. I couldn't hide from it. I knew that. One night, I sat on my couch, staring at the walls. I was exhausted, mentally and physically. I hadn't slept in days, and my body was shutting down. But still, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't escape the fear. That's when something clicked. I couldn't keep running. I couldn't keep hiding. I wasn't going to let this thing control me. I didn't know how or why he was doing this to me, but I knew that I had to face him, confront whatever it was that had latched onto me. It wasn't about defeating him, it was about taking back control. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside into the cold night air. I knew exactly where I was going. I didn't feel brave. I didn't feel ready, but I had to do this. The walk felt different this time. The streets, once menacing and unfamiliar, felt like something I could handle. The fear was still there, gnawing at me, but I held on to the thought that I was no longer the prey. I was walking to face whatever had been stalking me. As I reached the alley where it all began, I felt the pressure in the air, the sickening sensation that something was wrong. But this time, I didn't flinch. I didn't turn away. I kept walking, and then I saw him, standing under the lamppost, exactly where I had seen him before. The same smile, the same eyes, the same predatory stance. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I stood my ground. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice shaking, but louder than I'd ever dared to speak before. He tilted his head, the smile widening, but there was a flicker in his eyes. I saw it then. He was waiting for me to break. He was feeding off my fear, my hesitation. I clenched my fists, my heart pounding in my chest. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." The air shifted. It felt colder, darker, but it was different this time. He didn't move. His smile didn't falter, but there was something else in his gaze now. A recognition. "I know you," I said, my voice steady now. "And I'm done running." For a moment, nothing happened. The world seemed to hold its breath. And then, slowly, the man, whatever he was, began to fade. The shadows around him twisted, like they were being pulled away from him, and his form started to dissipate, dissolving into the air. He didn't speak. He didn't try to stop me. He just disappeared. I stood there for a long time, the streets quiet around me. The fear, the terror that had haunted me for so long was gone. I didn't know if it was over, if I had really defeated him, or if I had simply outlasted him. But I knew one thing for sure: I was still standing. The next few days passed in a haze. The feeling of victory, of having finally confronted the thing that had tormented me, was fleeting. It didn't take long for that creeping unease to return. I had faced him. I had stood my ground. But that didn't mean it was over. I couldn't shake the thought that there was something more to this, something I hadn't uncovered yet. The way he disappeared, so suddenly, without a word, it didn't feel like closure. It felt like a pause, a moment of waiting. Like the game hadn't ended, it had just taken a new turn. I knew what I had to do. I had to face him one more time. This time, there could be no hesitation, no fear. I had to prepare myself mentally and physically for whatever was coming next. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't need to. Eric would never understand, and I didn't care if he did. This wasn't something I could explain. It wasn't something anyone would believe. I spent the day researching everything I could about strange occurrences, about the dark entities that lived on the fringes of the real world. I found nothing concrete, just whispers, rumors, and stories from people who had experienced things like I had. I read about shadow people, about things that didn't belong in our world, and about people who were marked by them, cursed to carry their weight forever. But there was no answer. By nightfall, I was ready. I dressed in dark clothes, like I was preparing for a fight, though I had no idea what kind of fight I was preparing for. I couldn't help but think that everything I had done up to this point, every step I had taken, every thought I had been leading me to this moment. I wasn't just preparing to face him. I was preparing to face everything that had been building up inside me, the fear, the confusion, and the rage. I stepped outside, the air colder than it had been the night I first met him. The city felt emptier now, like the streets were holding their breath. But I wasn't afraid. I was determined. As I walked toward the alley again, I felt a strange calm. The same dread that had followed me for days seemed to have receded, replaced by a kind of steely resolve. I wasn't running this time. I was ready to confront whatever it was that had been following me. I reached the end of the street, and there it was, the alley. Dark and silent, as it had been before. I could feel the presence before I saw it. That familiar, oppressive weight in the air. I stepped into the alley without hesitation. And then I saw him. The man was standing there, just like before. The same smile stretched across his face, wider than I had ever seen it. But something was different this time. His form flickered, like he wasn't quite solid, like he was caught between worlds. His eyes gleamed with something new, something darker, something almost pleased. This time, I wasn't afraid. "I'm not running anymore," I said, my voice steady. "I'm done with you." And as I said those words, I realized something else. This wasn't just about him. It was about me. It was about reclaiming control, about no longer letting fear rule my life. This was the moment. This was the final confrontation. The air felt suffocating. Every breath I took seemed to fill my lungs with something cold and unnatural, like the very atmosphere was pushing back against me. The man's smile, that grotesque, impossibly wide grin, stretched further, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling sense of satisfaction. He was enjoying this. I stood still, my body tense, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. The streets were empty, silent, except for the faint rustling of the wind. But I didn't hear it. All I could hear was the sound of my heart pounding, like a drumbeat in the silence, echoing off the walls of the alley. The man didn't move. He just stood there, as if waiting for me to make the first move. "You're not real," I said, the words escaping from my mouth without thinking. But they felt right. He wasn't real. This, whatever this was, wasn't real. I didn't know how or why, but I had to believe that. The smile faded for a moment, just a flicker, but it was enough to make my stomach drop. This wasn't a game anymore. The thing in front of me wasn't playing by the rules of reality. It wasn't human. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel its power, its grip tightening around me. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, my voice louder this time. "I'm done running." And then, without warning, the man's head jerked to one side, a sickening crack echoing through the alley. It was as if his neck had bent at an unnatural angle, but it didn't stop there. His body followed, twisting violently, his movements jerky and disjointed. It was like he was being pulled apart and put back together in a way that defied all sense of logic. I stepped back, but the moment I moved, he was right there in front of me. His eyes were locked onto mine, the same hollow, unnerving stare that had followed me for days, weeks, maybe even longer. I could feel the air grow thicker, like the very world around me was trying to close in. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. And then he spoke. His voice wasn't a sound, it was a presence, a force that pushed its way into my mind. You cannot escape. It wasn't just words. It was a command. It was a feeling that took hold of me, sinking into my skin like ice, wrapping around my heart. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and for a moment, I thought I was going to break. Then, something inside me snapped. I wasn't just going to stand here and let him control me. I wasn't going to let him win. I took a deep breath, focusing everything on that single moment. I forced myself to meet his gaze, to push back against whatever force he was trying to impose on me. The smile on his face didn't falter, but there was something in his eyes now, a flicker of doubt. He hadn't expected me to fight back. "You don't control me," I said, my voice shaking, but stronger than I had ever heard it before. The man recoiled slightly, as if my words had struck him in some way. The smile on his face twisted into something more malevolent. The air around us seemed to grow colder, the shadows lengthening, curling like tendrils reaching for me. But I stood my ground. I couldn't back down now. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the small, silver object I had brought with me. It was a pocket knife, nothing special, but it was something I could hold onto, something solid. As I gripped it, the pressure in the air seemed to loosen just enough for me to take a step forward. The man's eyes widened, the smile stretching even further now, impossibly wide. He lunged at me, but this time I was ready. I swung the knife, not in an act of violence, but as a symbol, something to break the hold he had on me, something to sever the connection between us. As the blade met the air, something snapped. The man recoiled, a shriek echoing in my mind, a sound that was more than just noise. It was pure, raw terror, something that tore at the fabric of reality itself. The shadows around him began to flicker, like a broken image on a screen, and then just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. The alley was empty again. Silent. I stood there, trembling, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know if he was truly gone, if this was over, but for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt free. The weight had lifted. The air was clearer. The fear that had held me in its grip seemed to have vanished. But I knew something had changed. I had changed. I wasn't the same person who had walked into that alley. I wasn't the same person who had lived in fear. I had faced him. I had survived. And now I was free. The days that followed were a blur. The city felt different somehow, as if the air itself had shifted, lightened even. I didn't tell anyone what happened in that alley. How could I? Who would believe me? The man, the thing, was gone. Or at least, I thought he was. I moved on. I returned to my routine, went to work, hung out with Eric, but something had changed deep inside me. I wasn't the same person I had been before. Part of me had been shattered that night, and though I had faced the terror head-on, there was no way to piece it all back together. Not completely, but life goes on. The world doesn't stop just because you've stared into the abyss. It keeps moving, indifferent to your fear, your pain. And so did I. Every so often, when I'm walking alone at night, when the shadows stretch too long, when the silence feels too heavy, I wonder if he's out there. I'll glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see the grotesque grin, but it never comes. Not yet, anyway. Maybe it's over. Maybe I've won. Or maybe I've just made it angry. Maybe he's waiting. But I'm ready now. I'm not afraid anymore. At least, not like I was. It's been months since that night. I've tried to forget, to move on, but it lingers. The unease in my chest, the flicker of shadows at the edge of my vision. I've stopped walking alone at night, stopped searching for answers that only lead to more questions. But sometimes when the night is quiet, when I'm alone in my room, I still hear it. That faint, almost imperceptible laugh. It's never loud, never direct, but I know it's there. And when I look into the mirror sometimes, just for a second, I think I see a smile wide, impossibly wide, stretched across my reflection. Maybe I'll never escape it. Maybe I'll never be free. But I'll keep going, because no matter what, I'm still here.